The attic felt tighter, more suffocating, as the older kids circled around me like vultures. Their whispers and giggles seemed to echo louder than the creaking floorboards underfoot. Sarah, Kyle's girlfriend, stood out in the dim light, her long blonde hair shimmering like a golden rope, ready to choke the air out of me with its effortless perfection. I couldn't stand her, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't also envy her, and maybe even hate her. Kyle. I'd had a crush on him since we moved next door when I was 3. Our parents laughed and joked over poker nights, their loud voices filling the house as they wore those hideous Hawaiian shirts, while I sat quietly, staring at Kyle whenever I could without getting caught. But things changed. He grew taller, more handsome, while I just grew wider, fat. That's what they all called me. No matter how hard I tried to hide under my thick glasses and oversized shirts, my body betrayed me at every turn. The attic, already hot and stifling, felt even worse as I wiped sweat from my forehead. I could feel their eyes on me, especially Sarah's. She smirked as I adjusted my glasses, and I wished I could disappear into the floor. She didn't need to say anything. The disdain in her gaze was enough. I don't really want to play hide and seek. That's for babies. Sarah's voice was sharp, almost like she was scolding the air around her. She flipped her hair and shot me a glance that made my stomach twist. Adelaide, Kyle's little sister, pouted. She was only 10 but seemed far too hopeful. "We could play a board game instead," she offered, her voice small, fragile. She looked around the room, probably already knowing she'd be ignored. "Board games? Nah, let's do something fun," Kyle said with a grin that sent shivers down my spine. "Let's play truth or dare." My heart sank. The last time they forced me into that game, I was dared to run a mile, and when I collapsed in the dirt, gasping for air, they laughed, everyone but Adelaide, who silently handed me a glass of water. I could still hear their mocking laughter in my nightmares. Sarah's wicked smile told me everything I needed to know. She loved this. I was her entertainment, the freak for her amusement. "Come on, Lily, it'll be fun," she teased, nudging me. "We can promise not to make anyone eat bugs this time, right?" Kyle let out a soft chuckle, the sound low and almost predatory. "Yeah, no bugs this time." His grin grew sharper, more menacing. Adelaide frowned, still remembering the time they made her swallow a squirming insect, but she caved with a sigh. "Fine, as long as no gross stuff." Sarah made a show of crossing her heart. "I swear. Cross my heart and hope to die." Her smile stretched too wide, too perfect, like she was hiding something darker just beneath it. Something rotten. Kyle clapped his hands together. "Great. I'll go first, and we'll go in a circle." His eyes locked on mine, cold and calculating. "We'll start with you, Lily." His voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, something unsettling. Truth or dare? I swallowed hard, the attic growing even smaller, the walls closing in around me. There was no right answer. "Dare," I whispered, my voice barely audible. A slow, wicked smile spread across Kyle's face. Kyle's smirk twisted into something darker as I answered dare. He must have thought I'd pick truth, expecting me to embarrass myself with some awkward confession. Instead, he leaned back, eyes gleaming with mischief. "I dare you to do the splits," he said, his voice dripping with cruel amusement. For a moment, I relaxed. It wasn't as bad as I feared. At least I didn't have to run or humiliate myself with something worse. I shrugged, sinking to the floor, feeling the heat of their eyes burning into me. But as I tried to force my legs into the splits, my muscles screamed in protest, the strain unbearable. Laughter erupted around me, each cackle like nails on a chalkboard. My jeans felt like they were about to tear, and I gritted my teeth, pushing myself further into an awkward half-split. Their laughter never stopped. It rang in my ears, sharp and mocking, each chuckle a little more malicious than the last. I finally managed to push myself off the floor, trying to ignore the heat creeping up my neck. My skin crawled under their gazes, but at least the dare was over. It was my turn now, and I turned towards Sarah, trying to steady my voice. "Sarah, truth or dare?" I asked, hoping for something, anything, to deflect the attention away from me. Sarah didn't even flinch, rolling her eyes as if she'd already decided the game was beneath her. "Truth," she said, arms crossed, lips curled in that smug little smile. I blurted out the first thing that came to mind, a lame, weak question. "Do you want to kiss anyone in this room?" The silence that followed was suffocating. My question had barely left my lips before Sarah's vicious grin returned. She tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with a malevolent glint. "Oh, I've been dying to plant a big, sloppy kiss on your beautiful face, Lily." Her voice was sweet, sickeningly so, and she puckered her lips, blowing exaggerated kisses in my direction. The room erupted in laughter, even louder this time. It was cruel, cutting deeper than any dare could. I tried to laugh with them, but it came out hollow, fake. My skin crawled with the weight of their ridicule. I could feel Sarah's eyes on me, like she was savoring every moment of my discomfort. Adelaide, Kyle's little sister, interrupted the cruel scene with her eager, excited voice. "My turn," she chirped, pouncing on her toes, her enthusiasm breaking the tension. For a moment, the laughter died down, and even Sarah gave her a small, almost indulgent smile. "Truth or dare?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping the edge she used on me. "Dare," Adelaide squealed, unable to contain her excitement. She was practically buzzing with energy, her innocence almost too pure for this twisted little game. Sarah barely hesitated before offering her challenge, but there was something in her tone, something unsettling beneath the surface. "I dare you to spin in a circle really fast." Adelaide giggled, the dare seeming innocent enough, and raised her arms like a little ballerina. She began to twirl, faster and faster, her laughter filling the attic. But the longer she spun, the more something felt off. The room's air grew thick, suffocating as the shadows seemed to stretch and flicker with every spin. The others continued to watch, their eyes never leaving her, but no one moved to stop her. And the longer Adelaide spun, the louder her giggles became, until they weren't giggles anymore, but something else entirely. Adelaide twirled around, managing 3 clumsy spins before stumbling sideways, her little body collapsing onto the dusty floor. She giggled, her laughter unnervingly bright in the stifling heavy air of the attic. "That wasn't so bad," she chirped, completely unfazed by the fall, her innocence stark against the dark undertones of the game. With a dramatic point, she turned to Kyle, her eyes wide with excitement. "Truth or dare?" she asked, her voice ringing out like a challenge. Kyle, ever indifferent, shrugged. "Dare," he said casually, as if nothing in the world could unsettle him. Adelaide beamed, her face lighting up. "I dare you to do a backflip," she declared with a flourish, as if she had just issued the grandest of challenges. Without missing a beat, Kyle hopped onto an old, creaky chest that sat in the corner of the room. His movements were smooth, almost practiced, as he threw himself into a perfect backflip, the force of his landing sending a loud thud through the attic. The floorboards groaned beneath him, the sound echoing ominously. For a moment, I held my breath, certain that someone downstairs would hear the noise and come up to check on us, but no one came. The house remained eerily silent, like it was holding its breath, too. Kyle dusted himself off, brushing away the dirt that had swirled into the air with his landing. Then, he turned toward me, his gaze intense, his eyes locking onto mine like a predator eyeing its prey. "Your turn, Lily," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Truth or dare?" I swallowed hard, glancing up at the attic ceiling to break his gaze, pretending to weigh my options. The last dare hadn't been too bad, so I felt a little bolder. "Dare," I answered finally, hoping I wouldn't regret it. Kyle's smirk returned, but this time it seemed darker, more malicious. He pointed to the chest he'd just jumped from. the wood creaking ominously under his touch. "I dare you to stay inside the trunk for 5 minutes." A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the chest. It was old, large enough to fit me, but the thought of being locked inside, trapped in that dark, suffocating space, sent a wave of panic through me. I wasn't good with small spaces. Even crowded elevators made me sweat, but the chest, it looked like it could swallow me whole. Kyle sighed dramatically, already sensing my hesitation. "Are you going to do the dare or not?" His voice held a note of impatience, and I realized I had been unconsciously backing away, my feet moving on their own. I forced myself to step closer, my eyes fixed on the chest. "How long?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Kyle exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, who was watching with that same cold, cruel smile. "5 minutes should be long enough," she answered, her voice dripping with amusement. The attic suddenly felt much hotter, the air thick and heavy. My mouth went dry as I stared at the chest, my mind racing. Could I really go through with this? The thought of backing out crossed my mind, but Kyle's voice cut through the silence, sharp and mocking. "No backing out," he said, as if he could read my thoughts. With a flick of his wrist, Kyle flipped open the lid. The inside of the chest was mostly empty, save for something lying at the bottom, an old, crumpled white cloth. I reached down and lifted it, revealing a long-forgotten wedding dress, yellowed with age. The fabric was delicate, brittle, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Whoever had left it here had abandoned it carelessly, and yet it had once been beautiful, a relic from another time. The sight of it unsettled me, and I felt a strange sense of dread creep into my chest. Why had it been left here, hidden away in this dusty attic? The air around the dress seemed to hum with an unspoken memory, something long forgotten, or something waiting to be remembered. "That's so weird," Kyle muttered, tossing the dress back into the chest. "We'll leave it in there so there's something soft to lay on." His casual words did nothing to settle the growing lump in my throat. Just the thought of getting into that chest made my heart race, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. I forced myself to take deep, deliberate breaths, trying to calm the rising panic. It helped, but only a little. My fingers trembled as I wiped them against my jeans. Then Sarah let out a sharp, derisive laugh. I glanced over at her, and the look she gave me was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. Her eyes were cold, her lip curled in disgust, like I was something she had scraped off her shoe. "We all know you can't do it, Lily. You're too fat to get in that chest," she sneered, her voice dripping with malice. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but instead of crumbling under her cruelty, something inside me sparked, an ember of anger that flared up against the humiliation. What had I ever done to her? Sarah was always mean, always cruel, especially to me. Only Kyle seemed spared from her twisted moods. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. "I'm getting in that chest," I snapped, my voice trembling but firm. I just needed to catch my breath, that's all. Sarah folded her arms, her eyes narrowing as a smirk curled at the corner of her lips. "I'll believe it when I see it," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. She didn't believe me, none of them did, but I was going to prove them wrong. Taking a few more deep breaths, I marched toward the chest. Kyle stood nearby, watching with an unreadable expression, but when I reached the chest, he grinned and held the lid open. The hinges creaked ominously, like they hadn't been touched in years. The stale air inside the chest wafted out, bringing with it the scent of dust and age. Kicking off my shoes, I hesitated for a moment before stepping into the box. The old silk of the forgotten wedding dress brushed against my bare feet, cool and oddly comforting. It felt like a ghostly presence wrapping around me. Swallowing my fear, I lowered myself the rest of the way down, curling up on my side. The chest was cramped, barely large enough to fit me, and the dusty silk pressed against my face. I sneezed, the dust swirling around me. "Bless you," came Adelaide's small voice from somewhere outside the chest. Her voice was so far away, the air suddenly feeling thicker, heavier. "Thanks," I whispered, about to turn my head when slam. The lid of the chest came crashing down, sealing me inside with a loud, bone-rattling thud. Darkness swallowed me whole. My breath hitched, and before I could stop it, a coughing fit erupted as dust from the old chest filled my lungs. The silence outside was deafening, like the others had vanished, leaving me alone in this tomb of wood and silk. I tried to push against the lid, but it didn't budge. It felt heavier than it should have, like something, or someone, was holding it down. The darkness felt alive, pressing against my skin, making the space feel tighter. The comforting touch of the wedding dress now felt suffocating, wrapping around me like it had a mind of its own. My pulse quickened. 5 minutes, I reminded myself. Just 5 minutes. But the air was stifling, my breath shallow. And then, just beneath the fabric, I felt it, a cold, bony hand brushing against my skin. I could hear Sarah and Kyle murmuring just beyond the chest, their hushed voices blending with soft giggles that sent chills crawling up my spine. Then, without warning, their voices faded into an eerie silence. I shifted, trying to make myself comfortable in the cramped space, my back pressed against the stiff fabric of the wedding dress. I closed my eyes, but it made no difference. There was nothing to see, only the oppressive darkness wrapping around me like a second skin. The silence inside the chest was suffocating. It was so quiet, I could swear I could hear the dust settling onto my skin, each tiny particle grazing my bare arms. With every shallow breath, the heat inside the chest grew, making the air thick and stifling. I forced myself to breathe in small, measured gasps, trying not to think about how the walls seemed to press in closer with each passing second. The smell of mold clung to the dress beneath me, a sickening, earthy stench that filled my nostrils. I shifted, breathing through my mouth, but that only made it worse. Now the foul taste of decay coated my tongue, bitter and musty. I could feel it clinging to the back of my throat, refusing to leave, no matter how much I swallowed. I needed to distract myself, to make the time pass. I started counting in my head, measuring out the seconds in a futile attempt to calm my nerves. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. I counted over and over until I was certain 5 minutes had passed. But still, there was nothing. No sound, no movement from outside the chest. My heartbeat quickened, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me like a heavy, invisible force. I waited a few more seconds, the air growing thicker, before I reached up and gently knocked on the lid. "Guys?" I called out, my voice shaky but controlled. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time. The sound echoed in the tight space, dust swirling in the air and clinging to my sweaty skin. "Guys, let me out. It's been long enough." Still, only silence answered me. The faint thud of my own heartbeat was the only sound in the chest, pounding in my ears as the first whispers of panic started to creep in. My breath hitched, my chest tightening as a cold realization slithered through my mind. They weren't going to let me out. I shoved against the lid with both hands, expecting it to creak open, expecting the cool air of the attic to rush in and free me from this suffocating box. But it didn't budge. The lid remained sealed, as if the weight of the entire world was pressing down on it. My arms strained, trembling with effort, but no matter how hard I pushed, the chest refused to open. Panic bloomed in my chest, sudden and overwhelming, as adrenaline surged through my veins. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air inside the chest growing hotter, more oppressive. I banged on the lid again, harder, my fists slamming against the wood with desperate force. "Let me out, let me out." I screamed, my voice muffled by the thick wood, swallowed by the darkness. Surely someone had to hear me. Surely someone would come. But the silence was deafening, unbroken, like the others had disappeared, leaving me alone in this dark, stifling tomb. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. They had locked me in. They weren't just playing a prank. They meant to keep me here, trapped in this coffin of wood and dust, until their twisted sense of humor was satisfied, or worse, until I was nothing more than a forgotten memory. A surge of raw fear gripped me, and I thrashed wildly in the chest, kicking and shoving, desperate to break free. My legs tangled in the wedding dress, and I felt a sharp sting as my toe scraped against the rough wood. The chest rocked violently beneath me, but no matter how much I struggled, I couldn't get free. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening until it felt like I was suffocating, the darkness pressing against my skin, against my mind. Let me out. I screamed again, my voice hoarse, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But deep down, I knew there was no one coming. The chest was my prison, and I was utterly alone. I started to cry, no, not just cry. I was sobbing, my chest heaving with every desperate breath, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. My hands clawed uselessly at the sides of the chest, my fingernails scraping against the rough wood, but it was worthless. The tiny, suffocating space grew hotter with every passing second, like I was trapped in a furnace, each breath thick with the sensation of breathing in steam. How long could I actually stay in here? What if they were outside right now, just beyond the lid, listening to my panicked breaths and sobbing cries, laughing to themselves? Maybe this was exactly what they wanted, the fear in my voice, the begging, the terror. Maybe they wanted to hear me break. Okay, you got me. My voice was barely above a whisper, cracked and trembling. I'm really scared. Please, I just want to get out. You've won, okay? I'm scared. I'm really scared. My words dissolved into sobs again. The tears, mixed with the sweat dripping down my face, stung my eyes. But there was no response. No sound from outside. No giggling, no footsteps. Just silence, and endless, crushing silence. For all I knew, they had left me completely alone, abandoned in this box to rot. Please, I whimpered, my voice breaking. I just want to go home. Another sob racked my body, and that's when I felt a tiny, prickling sensation along my skin. I hadn't noticed it before, in the midst of my frantic attempts to free myself. But now, I could feel it. Tiny legs skittering, crawling across my bare arms. My stomach dropped as I realized what it was: bugs, hundreds of them. My thrashing must have disturbed a nest that had been living in the dress. Panic hit me like a tidal wave, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode from my chest. The scurrying intensified, and I screamed a loud, desperate scream that seemed to echo in the small, suffocating space. I hate bugs. I've always hated them, to the point where I couldn't even squish one on my own. I'd have to call for my mom or dad. But there was no escaping them now. They were everywhere. Their tiny legs scampered along my arms, my neck, my face finding no threat in my trembling body. They moved freely, crawling over my skin as if I were already dead. I could feel them tangling in my hair, their legs brushing against my lips. I clamped my mouth shut as tight as I could, terrified that if I opened it, they'd crawl inside, infest my very body. Their antennae brushed against my trembling lips, and I could feel their movements so intimately close. My body was frozen in sheer terror, and the heat. God, the heat was unbearable. I couldn't breathe properly anymore. It was like the air itself had turned to fire, and every breath I took was scorching my lungs. I prayed silently, begging for it to stop. I wanted it to end. The bugs crawled, unchecked, as I choked back bile, the nausea overwhelming me. My body couldn't take it anymore. The heat, the stress, the fear all hit me at once, and I retched, vomiting inside the chest. The acidic bile burned my throat as it spilled from my mouth, coating the inside of the box with a sickening stench. There was nowhere for it to go. I rolled onto my side, the vomit pooling beneath me, my body trembling uncontrollably. The bugs scurried away from the bile, but they were still there, crawling over every inch of my skin, burrowing into the dress, into my hair. I could barely keep my eyes open, my vision swimming in and out of focus. My ears felt stuffed with cotton, and the heat. The heat was unbearable. I wasn't going to survive this. I knew that now. I slammed my head against the side of the chest one final time, a weak, pitiful gesture of defiance, and whimpered. Then, as the world darkened, I felt my consciousness slip away. I knew, in that moment, that if I passed out, I might never wake up again. But then, I did wake up. My eyes fluttered open, but everything was distorted. My vision was blurred, swimming in and out of focus like I was drowning. My ears still felt muffled, the sounds of the world distant and indistinct. I was choking on stale air, on the lingering taste of vomit, and all I could think was that I was still trapped. And I wasn't sure if I'd ever get out. I could hear voices distant and muted, but their words were lost in the fog that clung to my mind. I didn't know who was speaking, nor did I understand who I was or where I was. Then, suddenly, water splashed across my face, sharp and cold, jolting me from the haze. My vision sharpened, and there, looming above me like a ghost, was my father's frantic face. "Lily, Lily, can you hear me?" His voice was a scream, desperation lacing each syllable as he poured another glass of water over my face. I opened my mouth, and water rushed in, choking me. I stared up at him, struggling to comprehend what was happening, managing only a faint wheeze of acknowledgement. Beneath my head, the cold linoleum felt like heaven against my heat-addled brain. I realized with dawning horror that I was in the kitchen downstairs. But how had I gotten out of that suffocating chest? "She's alive." My father's voice broke through my thoughts, relief flooding his tone. Tears glistened in his eyes as he lifted me off the floor, which was no small feat, and began to carry me out of the house. The distant wail of an ambulance siren pierced the air, growing louder as if it were racing toward us. Someone must have called it. My head lolled to the side, and I glanced back. There they were, Kyle, Sarah, and Adelaide. As my vision focused again, I could see that Adelaide was hysterical, clinging to her mother, her tiny body shaking with the force of her sobs. Her face was bright red, eyes squeezed shut, tears streaming down her cheeks. Sarah and Kyle, however, looked furious, their expressions twisted in anger and perhaps a touch of fear. I tried to call out to them, to understand, but before I could voice my thoughts, I was lifted into the ambulance. The following days blurred together as I lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to N4, fluid being pumped back into my ravaged body. They said I was treated for hypothermia, the same fate that befell kids locked in hot cars. "You're very lucky to be alive," the doctor told me, but I still didn't know how long I'd been trapped in that box. All I knew was that I wouldn't have lasted much longer. The heat could have killed me, or I might have choked on my own vomit. I slowly regained my strength, but the aftermath lingered. For days, even weeks after returning home, my parents remained tight-lipped about how they found me, as if afraid to speak of it until I was strong enough to bear the truth. They told me that after locking me in that chest, Kyle and Sarah dragged Adelaide downstairs and claimed they intended to leave me in there for much longer than 5 minutes. Sarah had said she wanted to see how long it would take for anyone to notice I was missing. Adelaide had protested, but they wouldn't let her go back upstairs. In a brave moment, she snuck away, racing up to the attic and unlocking the chest. Her screams echoed in that hellish room, and it was her cries that brought my parents running. They said she had thought I was dead when she found me, but Kyle and Sarah denied everything. "We didn't see her all day," Sarah insisted, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. Kyle shook his head, claiming I had probably locked myself in there for attention, trying to get him in trouble. His parents believed him without question, despite Adelaide corroborating my story. They convinced themselves that my predicament had been the result of my own stupidity, and they demanded compensation for the old wedding dress I had ruined. But my parents believed me, and that was the end of our family's friendship. We moved away soon after, seeking a fresh start in a place where kids didn't whisper about me behind my back, where Kyle and Sarah couldn't spread rumors that I was some attention-seeking psycho. Ever since that incident, I'd grown to loathe the heat. It sent me spiraling into panic attacks, forcing me to sleep with the lights on for years. Nightmares plagued me, visions of being strangled by a wedding dress or overrun by insects. Therapy became a constant in my life, but nothing seemed to quell the anger I felt toward the past. Now, years later, I found myself back in my old hometown. Tracking down Kyle was easier than I thought. Sarah, on the other hand, had taken time and effort to locate. When I finally did, she wasn't thrilled to see me, especially after I revealed my intention to play one last game of truth or dare. Kyle, however, still lived in that same old house. When I knocked on his door, he let me in without recognizing me, looking at me as though I were just another lost soul seeking refuge. The years had not been kind to him. While I had grown taller and stronger, shedding the fat for muscle, he was prematurely balding, a beer belly beginning to form beneath his lightly wrinkled shirt. The box I brought for him might not even be big enough,